Ohayou gozaimasu, minasan. My name is Michael Jeck, and I program repertory theaters and introduce films on television. The film we'll be talking about today is Kumonosujo, English title Throne of Blood, literal translation Castle of the Spider's Web, and it is the great director Akira Kurosawa's adaptation of Macbeth to a Japanese context, made in 1957, the same year he adapted Maxim Gorky's Lower Depths. Obviously a man of wide-ranging eclectic tastes. Read a lot of Shakespeare. Macbeth happened to be his favorite, and this adaptation is acclaimed by critics around the world as the greatest adaptation of Shakespeare to the cinema ever made, particularly because it is both Shakespeare and cinema. So many of them are obviously going to be filmed stage productions or the equivalents thereof. This one translates it fully into a movie. I said this Shakespeare happens to be his favorite play. And adaptation, yes, we're not going to hear any of the language, obviously, because it's going to be in Japanese. Well, as Kurosawa himself has said, it's contemporary Japanese, somewhat formalized. Not completely formalized because he didn't want it to be not easily understood. And when there are songs and chants, they will be in the style of the No theater. And in fact, this production is going to be heavily influenced by No theater, and I'll be pointing out those influences and those aspects as we go along. And of course, it is an adaptation. Kurosawa has shaped this story of Macbeth to his own ends, and I'll be talking about those changes, how he compresses, how he expands, and how he adds extra motivation, and in a sense clarifies a lot of things that in Shakespeare's Macbeth is seemingly left up in the air. Well, we begin right away with wind, talk about a trademark, a remote landscape mist, and now the chorus. Well, the chorus is a big part of the No theater, and this is in the No style. The No is the earliest form of Japanese theater dating back to the 13th to 14th centuries. It reached its heyday in the 15th and 16th. It's supplanted by kabuki, which then became the most popular. Well, the No is for the lords and gentry of the time. The common people didn't have anything but perhaps some kind of folk representations. And it is much more austere, like the original ancient Greek drama. The No starts off with normally no more than two people on an extremely bare stage with nothing but generally a painting of a pine tree, and props are minimal, and lots of it is chanted. Well, you get an idea right away here. And we're talking about, well, is this the present? We're talking about the past? Interesting question. We don't know what time this is, but it is looking past to a remote time of great warriors. And in fact, we're going to come back here again because this whole picture is constructed in a very circular fashion. Let me just note that this post here, which commemorates the castle, simply says Kumonosujo, which is the name of the film, and the name of the castle, once again, Castle of the Spider's Web. And when I say circular, well, it is very much, as Kurosawa said at the time, an experiment. It is a very formally structured film, unusual for him, and particularly at this time, which the fan club might describe as the great period of the dynamic, kinetic filming style and the powerful, if not always affirmative, tragedies, then life-affirming stories, as opposed to what the critics might describe as the late period, post-1970, of a less elaborate camera and editing style and a very nihilistic, tragic, looking into the abyss style, a la, say, Ran, which is also filmed on Mount Fuji, as we can see from this dark volcanic soil, as was Hidden Fortress, but then that's a kind of a comedy. Well, we're already into Kurosawa's stylistics, the telephoto lens, and then also the ambience of this picture, which is going to be dark, gloomy, and crummy weather throughout, and then one of the world's largest but widest and squattest castles, built in 3 dimensions on the slopes of Mount Fuji. Here you can see the telephoto lens very strongly, which will tend to flatten the image, like when you have the center field shot of the pitcher throwing to the batter. Then we see a very characteristic of Kurosawa style, the wipe, which nobody else, for the most part, uses. Kurosawa is a man of extremes. He likes hot summers, big rainstorms, and hard winds. But of course, if you're on Mount Fuji, you're going to get them anyway. But then, if it wasn't large enough, there's big wind machines just off screen. Why is he carrying that big old banner on his back? Well, that's so people know whether he's an enemy or a friend, because you didn't have uniforms in those days. It's called a sashimono, and just about everybody carries them. You will see our heroes, Toshiro Mifune playing Washizu, that is the Macbeth character, and Minoru Chiaki as Miki, the Banquo, carrying them as they run through the dark and dense forest. There are lots of enemies and friends out there because this is the Sengoku Jidai, roughly the period between 1300 and 1600. Tending probably toward the 15th century, because you will see there's no guns. Muskets come in about the early part of the 16th century in Japan and become prevalent by the end of the century. So this is probably in the 1400s. It took 3 great lords, 3 powerful generals, dominant personalities, the late 16th, early 17th century, to unify the country under the Tokugawa shogunate. Now, the gentleman speaking here is the actor Takashi Shimura. 20 films for Kurosawa, and he is now about 52 years old. This is a changing of the guard picture, because from 1948 to now, he either starred in or co-starred equally with Toshiro Mifune in all of Kurosawa's pictures, with one exception, that is The Idiot. This is his first small supporting role, and from here on out, his parts will dwindle. But this man, as I said, was equal to the great star, to Toshiro Mifune, for all this period. And in fact, of course, he starred in Ikiru by himself. We're talking about the leader of the 7 Samurai, mentor to Toshiro Mifune in Stray Dog, and Drunken Angel, in other words, more imposing, as it were. And it's a changing of the guard of his regulars, but then this is a stock company, and these people keep on coming. But I'll start to talk about each one of them as they start to come on. Meantime, let's talk about this gigantic castle. Let me note that only the exterior was built on Mount Fuji. This is built, interior is built on the Toho backlot in Tokyo. And you notice the ground kind of matches that dark volcanic soil. Well, they truck-loaded a whole bunch of soil back to Tokyo to make the interior match. This castle is built in a rather unusual style. Overall, they were looking for the style of Tsubokoga, or ink paintings, and they brought in an expert in musha-e, picture scrolls of battle scenes, a guy who reconstructed them, Kohei Ezaki, and he designed a castle. A tall, imposing castle, and Kurosawa vetoed it and said, "I want it wide and squat," and there was a big fight, but guess who won? Now, we just heard the messenger note that the traitor offered to shave his head in token of obeisance, perhaps. Why is that so drastic? Well, if you shave your head, you're not a samurai anymore. You've renounced the world. You have to become a monk. In Harakiri, when Tatsuya Nakadai cuts off the top knots of the samurai he's gunning for, their lord ordered them to commit seppuku, ritual suicide. Well, now I've said Kurosawa is a man of extremes. Obviously, he likes heavy rainfall, and this is the first rain we're going to see, and we are only going to see it at certain places. I mentioned the circular construction. Everything happens again. Well, now, riding through the forest, which is the forest of the spider's web, as you will see, this is a maze, which helps the defense of the castle. And these guys should know it, but, well, they have their problems. Now we're going to see a particular Kurosawa motif that he uses throughout, and no one ever uses, and that is what I like to call the cut pans, where these pans of different people, sometimes the same person, are cut together to give the impression that it's all the same person. And no one else does it. Now, of course, it's extremely difficult because this is all telephoto shot. He loves telephoto lens. And they're shooting for extra dynamism through the foliage. Now they've gone left to right 3 times. They're going to go right to left. So where does that bring them? Right back where they started. Well, those pans with telephoto narrows what you're shooting at so tightly you can make mistakes. And lots of times when they were galloping, they heard the cameraman yell, no, good, you're out of frame. Well, the cameraman in here is, in fact, the director of photography, because under the Japanese system, he operates the camera as well as does the lighting. And that's the great Azekazu Nakai, who did 10, 11, 12, 13 pictures with Kurosawa, most recently, for instance, 7 Samurai. And at one point, Kurosawa said that Azekazu Nakai and I think it was Takeo Saito were the only 2 cameramen in Japan who could handle his multi-camera system, because most of this is shot with 2, 3, 4 cameras running simultaneously. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Maintains continuity, etc. That way the actors can't be terribly conscious of the camera, and they can't play to any one camera in particular. Well, now these gentlemen look pretty good on their horses. Well, it's obvious they didn't just take up horse riding for this film. And in fact, the great star Toshiro Mifune and Minoru Chiaki as Miki, the Banquo figure, were both in 7 Samurai. Now, while Mifune had previously studied at the Takeda School of Horse Archery, these 2 actors and Takashi Shimura, the gentleman I mentioned previously, the leader of the samurai, all bought together a horse and went horse crazy during the course of that film and rode all the time. So here, actually, it looks very dangerous what they're doing, going at a gallop through this forest, but of course they're riding on paths, which are made to look much narrower or non-existent by the flattening effect of the telephoto lens. Now there's the first cry of a spirit, and you'll notice that the rain stops dead. Not the thunder, but the rain stops dead at that point. What is that hut doing there in the middle of nowhere? Well, of course, in the middle of nowhere, we're back in the studio. There was a cut on a tree or thereabouts, but that's why he's Kurosawa, you can't see it. You don't get that kind of ground fog out in the middle of nowhere, and that's probably produced by dry ice. That's what Toho would normally do. This is the first close-up, in fact, and he just happens to ride his horse right up where it counts into the telephoto lens. This is very direct no influence. And let me note also that there are 2 kinds of no. That's the Genzai, which is just contemporary real-world type of stuff. But then there's the Mugen, which is the phantasmagorical, which has a supernatural element. And in fact, it's something very specific, which would be obvious to no fans in the audience, although they would not be the majority. This witch, that is what it is, and this hut comes straight from the no play Kurozuka, or the Black Mound. And the makeup of the witch, when we will see her head on, it's based on the mask Yama-uba, or Mountain Witch. And here, travelers come upon a witch who later complains of its life and then turns into a demon and attacks them. Well, that's not exactly what's going to happen here. As you will see in the course of her singing, if we want to call it that, she's going to enunciate a rather bizarre philosophy in which after death there is nothing except, of course, she's immortal. What does live on if there's no afterlife? But somebody's immortal. Well, I'm not exactly expert on Buddhism, but remember this is a demon as well, so perhaps they're designed to confuse. The witch is played by the actress Chieko Naniwa. Little hard to tell with that very heavy makeup and that extra spotlighting as well, unearthly lighting. And her voice is extremely distorted, so much so that at some place I believe I read that the voice was re-recorded by a male actor, but I don't know if that is the case. The sound throughout this is extremely distorted because all the male voices When those were re-recorded and transferred and so forth, Kurosawa went and turned off all the highs, knocked out the treble. So we're going to have grunts, barks, groans, animalistic sounds from all the men. And of course, then Toshiro Mifune starts off at the bass range, gives you an idea. Well, I talk about the actor Toshiro Mifune as though we all should know, but then he is the most famous Japanese actor ever, the one who's likely to be known to the world. And he's appeared in a lot of American films. For instance, Grand Prix, 1941, Hell in the Pacific, etc. For a 17-year period, he starred in 16 of Kurosawa's 17 films. As David Shipman said, the greatest actor-director partnership in film history. I think that's definitely true. There's no contender for this. They identified with each other so much. Now, the other actor is Minoru Chiaki. I mentioned that he was the wood-chopping samurai, the genial one in Seven Samurai. Beginning in 1949, he appeared in 10 straight Kurosawa pictures, and in fact was the third most important actor after Takashi Shimura and Toshiro Mifune for Kurosawa. Always led the supporting cast with a wide range. Genial samurai, poisonous younger son of Mifune in I Live in Fear. Later on, either R2-D2 or C-3PO in The Hidden Fortress, which of course is the original of Star Wars. And he was one of those very annoying and animalistic peasants in that, and models for the robots. In fact, he ran a theater company in the 40s of his own, and he created the part in The Quiet Duel that Mifune later played on screen. Well, I've said that this picture is very formalized, stylized, an experiment. It is circular in structure, not just for fun, but because it is infused throughout with a feeling of fate. These people cannot escape their destiny. Macbeth has choices, as we will see as we go along. Washizu, that is the Macbeth character, does not exactly have choices. We will see him visually being painted into a corner, literally. And it is all via the prophecy foredestined, because just when he thinks he's going to escape, he does not. It's very different from Macbeth that way, and that much darker and nihilistic, and that's why it's unusual in this period for Kurosawa, but it fits right in with, for instance, Ran, another look at the abyss. Now, you notice the camera does not favor one or the other of these two boys. If you noticed in the reports of their heroics, first difference from Macbeth is they're much more equal here. And in fact, you may wonder why Washizu is favored when it's time for the promotions. Well, he is, of course, senior. Now, since this is a spirit, it's about to do a big fat disappearing act, and I'll describe a little bit how it goes. You can watch what happens, because the mountain witch will stand up, and then the gown will be whipped away, presumably by wires or filaments, and then boom, as the gown was being whipped around by the wires or the fan, it almost covered the screen. Then Kurosawa cut to a shot of the gown covering the screen and whipped that away where the actor was no more, but then it was a completely separate shot. Now we'll have another disappearing act. This is much more simple, because as they advanced through the hut, they got out of sight of it. And then the hut, of course, was flown into the rafters, since we're back in the studio, and as the camera came back, it wasn't where it was before. Well, now we're hearing, of course, and we have for a while, the very ominous music, and it's by Masaru Sato. I mentioned there was a changing of the guard. Well, from 1948 to 1955, Kurosawa's music was always done by his dear friend Fumio Hayasaka, who then died during the production of his previous film, I Live in Fear. And then his colleague protege Masaru Sato took over and scored every Kurosawa film from here on until 1965. As I say, Takashi Shimura faded out, Hayasaka died, and we had new people come in. Transience, well, I guess that's illustrated right here, isn't it? The fog. Well, Kurosawa at one point said he just liked the idea of samurai riding in and out of the fog, galloping in and out of the fog. And in fact, this was rather difficult to shoot because, as you can see, well, here they ride right into the fog. How do they get back to where the camera is? Well, the cameraman kept yelling, "Hey, we're here," and they'd go toward the sound. Sometimes they missed it. They shot this a whole lot. God knows what the shooting percentage might have been. And in fact, they're going to go in and out of the fog 11 or 12 times, depending on how you count this. Sometimes, actually, it's one shot where they ride off here, for instance, and you can see them in the background, and they turn and come right back. And other times, there's going to be obvious cuts, and then they come in at different angles. Is that just fog as symbol? Well, of course, it's both real fog, because that's what the weather is like, and then it is a symbol in the sense of the confusion thereof, of the minds of these two people. But then you can go back, and that miasmic forest, is that a symbol of Washizu's mind? Well, there are lots of symbols in that respect, or ways you can take it that way. And maybe the whole film is an example of Washizu's mind, or perhaps also a fever dream of Macbeth as interpreted by Dostoevsky in his fever dream style. And in fact, Dostoevsky is Kurosawa's absolute favorite author, as evidenced in so many of his particular pictures. Well, a critic or two with a lust for symbolism has tried to figure out a pattern that will be meaningful of how these sequences of in and out of the fog are cut together. Some people look for symbolism anywhere, and it seems to me that they probably shot for hours and got lots of lousy footage, and he said, well, I can use this bit, this bit, this bit, and this bit. How will it cut together for the most rhythmic or pleasing pattern? And once again, one has to remind oneself that it is a drama and not just a whole bunch of symbols. And Kurosawa himself, while a great pictorialist, has never been accused of that damning indictment of when a director dies, he becomes a photographer, or switching from dramatically effective pictures to just plain pretty pictures. There's no fat in Kurosawa's films. Something may look striking and beautiful, but it's also there just for dramatic emphasis, and that is what it's staged for. If it looks beautiful, well, that's good too. Throughout this shot, the fog is going to dissipate, and the castle is going to get more and more revealed. He was relentless at trying to get these effects, a true perfectionist. And we're going to see an example of that right here. Kurosawa did this over a period of days until he got the right shot. Also, that's the second version of the castle. They built it rather flat, not three-dimensional, and it was a complete set. And Kurosawa said, it just doesn't work. Let's tear it down and start over. And that's what they did. But of course, they could afford it at that time. It was a very big budgeted picture, but it wasn't considered a big stretch at the time. Why is that? Well, Rashomon had made him world famous. It had put Toho Studios on the world map. Then he made Seven Samurai, almost bankrupted the studio, but it was a gigantic, super-duper hit. And in those days, the studios were very flush. TV had made no inroads. And if you were at the top of your profession, if you were a big-name guy like Mizoguchi Ozu or Kurosawa, I'm not going to say money was no object, but the budget questions did not enter in the same kind of way, and people didn't blanch at your demands as they would later on because you had no competition. And just to put it in perspective, they shot this in summer or fall of 1956 and was issued in January 1957, and right after that, in 1957, Seven Samurai premiered in the United States. And obviously that was going to make a gigantic world splash as well. Here was a guy who was real hot. Also, other studios were making inroads on Toho's dominance of the period film, and they said, okay, let's knock them dead with a big super production. Well, now we see the wipe again and an example of how it's used. Brief intervals. This is all just one day. This is the night of the day before. We also see a 180 flip. In other words, we're tracking back in front of them. Now we're behind them tracking forward. Pretty much only Kurosawa does that. It's certainly, you're never going to see a 180 flip in American films. Now, surprise, you guys are promoted. In the play, in fact, Ross informs at least Macbeth in advance. This is a complete surprise to them. And just like for knights to be knighted, well, here you get a new lordship, you get a sword, apparently. And also look at their sashimonos. You're going to find out what their symbols are. Washizu's is a centipede. That's not too nice. And here's the first straight-ahead close-up while they're trying to suppress emotion and surprise. It's hard to direct or act trying to maintain no expression and mostly succeeding, but you can tell what they're thinking. Well, that's why he's Toshiro Mifune. And now we'll see Miki's sashimono, and what his symbol is, it's a rabbit. Well, that doesn't mean he's a coward. It means he's real fertile. And of course, since he's Banquo, he will institute a long line of kings. And here's his close-up, and just the flicker of the eyebrows, and the strain and tension of maintaining no expression as a good samurai should. But also, I'm not going to show that this has shocked the hell out of me, as opposed to gratifying me, because, of course, these guys know something that other people don't. The prophecies were correct. Now, of course, they can't suppress everything, because at one point, Miki's going to look over at Washizu, and then they will both look at each other. Now, well, that's the end of the first day. And as we'll see, it's the end of the first act. There are 4 acts. This is a very structured story. Shakespeare himself has 5 acts, but in a sense, this is even more structured than Shakespeare because we only have 4 temporal blocks. Shakespeare often is rather ambiguous about the time frame. Here, fade to black, a lot of time has passed. And here we're at North Castle. Well, that's where Washizu is now lord of. This is one of the very few times during the day with no rain going on, it seems to me. And at the beginning of each act break, we're going to have a call from the chorus. Well, here's some of his officers talking about how things have changed. In Macbeth, the very next day after the investiture of Macbeth and Banquo with their honors, Duncan goes right to visit Macbeth's castle at Inverness. Obviously, here a long time has passed, and you noticed that Lord Tsuzuki did not say, "I'm going to visit you." He said nothing. He just invested them with their new honors. Well, now we have kind of what's obviously an audience room. It's pretty bare. That would be both true of the architecture of Japanese homes as a whole, but then also of the no stage, which is just flat wood. Very few, if any, props, symbolic props, not realistic ones, and a pine tree painted in the back. So we're getting a flavor of both. We're also meeting Lady Washizu, or Asaji, played by Isuzu Yamada, one of Japan's greatest actresses, and in eminence, if not general star power or box office, practically equal to Toshiro Mifune. In films from the age of 15, a star from her middle to late teens, since she was born in 1917. Mifune was born in 1920. Well, she's a big star in memorable classic films since the mid-30s. Notice he's not looking at her. That's partly a no construction and partly body language. Now he does look at her when she says this very pregnant statement. Notice also in the background, we have that horse going in a circle. Well, that is in a sense symbolic of the circular structure, but of course it's also realistic. They work out, exercise the horses, and how do you exercise in the courtyard? You go in a circle. Also, here's a difference from Macbeth. Macbeth is always gunning for Duncan. Here he's got to be talked into it. He can't let it go because he's going to be destroyed because obviously Lord Suzuki, if he hears about the prophecies, Well, he's got to eliminate him. This is a case of no choice and fate. And of course, since unlike Duncan, who was a noble king, we have noticed that Suzuki killed his own master, when talking about high treason, to become lord, you know that he would. This is another change, almost giving the motivation that Shakespeare left out. Well, obviously motivation, compelled to preserve his own life. Where does that leave you, Washizu? And where does that put you in the whole pattern of betrayals? After all, Suzuki betrayed his own lord and murdered him, and then Fujimaki was a traitor and attacked his own lord. What is he going to do, and what are other people going to do down the line? Now, that's the first time she's moved at all, and of course it's one of the most chilling moves. Well, I said a great actress is Yamada. Kurosawa said to her, now, don't blink. And she's modeling, as it were, the Shikumi mask, which is of a beauty no longer young, someone about to go mad. Yamada later this same year would appear opposite Mifune in Kurosawa's The Lower Depths, and later another picture called Downtown. Perhaps the only picture where Toshiro Mifune got the girl in this case is Uzu Yamada, which is a wonderful Warner Brothers working-class melodrama that has been undistributed in the United States. She would later appear in Yojimbo, returned mainly to the stage in the later 60s, and is still alive today in 2002, apparently in vigorous health. Such was Toshiro Mifune's regard for her that about 18 years ago, when he was having his own retrospective at Japan Society in New York City, when they were preparing his clip show for his appearance on stage, well, they were looking at clips from this picture, and he stopped at one point and said, "Forget about me. Look at her. Now that's real acting." Well, here's the big surprise. Remember in Macbeth, Duncan says, "I'm coming to visit you at your castle." They have just here discussed what they're going to have to do about Suzuki, and now here he is. Remember, we was watching this picture from ground zero, and as probably most Japanese might well not know the plot of Macbeth in a way that we all seem to. Well, is he coming and going to be gunning for Washizu? This is going to be up in the air. This is what they were afraid of. This castle, by the way, is the third location of 3 in this whole picture. And the others, of course, are the Cobweb Castle itself and the forest. This is built in near the town of Nagaoka in the Izu Peninsula, 50 miles south of Tokyo, thereabouts. This sequence was shot, in fact, by Kurosawa, typical of his methods. Each shot was covered by 2 cameras at completely different angles from each other. And now here's a continuity area. Notice in the far long shot, the farmers all have knelt down in obeisance to the Lord. And here, oops, they're still getting in position. But in fact, Donald Ritchie, in his great book, Films of Akira Kurosawa, talks about watching them shoot this sequence and why, as his crew says, he was Toho's best director, Japan's best scenarist, and the world's greatest editor, because he shot about every angle with 2 cameras and sometimes multiple takes. At one point, a retainer slipped and fell as he ran in and said, well, it's a little too much realism. And then he cut it all out to this very brief sequence with the wipe, with the brief change of time. Here's another element of where he's adding the motivation. Why does he bother to visit Macbeth or Washizu? Here he's got a reason. Fujimaki the traitor, well, he linked up with Inui, and now he's going to give it the works. But here's the planning involved and the assignments. This is also the typical seating arrangement for these kind of audiences, staff conferences, councils. So the Lord sits at the back of the wall, and then they have the two parallel lines facing each other coming down from him. And then they only turn to look at him when they're taking orders. Here's the wipe. It's later the same day. There's all these just four temporal blocks that are continuous within them in the three locations. Now, look here. We're just seeing Washizu's feet. This is another circular element that we'll come back to much later on in a slightly different context. And the bare room, the bare feet on the wooden floor with just the pallet and the standing candle. And also a diagonal construction that he likes so much. And even now, Washizu, unlike Macbeth, is not interested and is so happy to be off the hook. And yet somehow it just never works out. It helps that Lady Asagi always has an answer for him. In many ways, she's much nastier than Lady Macbeth. Arrows will seek your life, not only from the front, from the rear. Here's another circular element. She doesn't know it, but she's one swell prophet. As I said, she's a lot nastier than Lady Macbeth. Some people have said, oh, he's a misogynist. He doesn't understand women. They're always so negative. Well, if at one end of the spectrum we have Lady Asagi, pure evil here, at the other end we have Setsuko in No Regrets for Our Youth, noble and powerful. And then somewhere in the middle, think about it, we have Lady Kaede from Ran, who is getting her own revenge and doing it magnificently as though Toshiro Mifune himself would do it. We can see that while he doesn't do it too often, his women have a wide spectrum of possibilities. And of course, he's somewhat constrained by how he depicts them in a very macho society if he's going to be realistic. We have a straight cut to the gallery outside. This actor, Takeshi Kato, one of his very first pictures for Kurosawa. He was just an acting student. And in fact, he's getting to be very prominent because he exchanges identities with Mifune in The Bad Sleep Well and later as a detective in High and Low. This actor, Yoshio Tsuchiya, played Rikichi, the most powerful farmer in Seven Samurai, the firebrand who will stop at nothing to become the equivalent of a samurai. Well, I guess he was poised for a big acting career. You would think so, since he studied to become a doctor, got the degree, and then quit to become an actor. But since apparently he was one of the most eccentric of men, he preferred not to keep going and have a great career as a dynamic star, but mostly portray aliens and people possessed by aliens in science fiction movies. But then he was obsessed by aliens in private life. And in fact, has written a number of books, some of which are about UFOs. Well, this is a stock company, and all these people have worked together many times. We get a sense of the U-shaped structure of this end of the North Castle. Well, why do they have to sleep in the Forbidden Room? I guess it's the Lord is using their bedroom. The room we previously saw on the other side of the U would be their audience room, reception room, even as bare as it is. And this is the guest bedroom, even though that's where the traitor Nujimaki killed himself. Remember, he wanted to shave his head and become lost to the world. They said no, and then he begged for his life anyway, which would be very cowardly. Now, how do you commit seppuku, which is the correct term? Harakiri is only a technical term, means stomach cut. Well, this looks a little bloody. No, I haven't seen one in real life, but I've seen it on film, and I know how it's described. First, you insert the knife in your stomach, draw it across, and then if you're a real man, or in the old days, you reach up and cut the right side of your neck, and finishing yourself off and making a big blood gush. Well, in the later days, a friend would cut your head off to finish things. Here in America, crows don't sound too good, but that's a symbol of death for Japanese. Having seen it on screen, that looks like an extra lot of blood. The blood hit both corners of the Forbidden Room. That's a little unusual, but why not build up the horror in this case? Well, you will notice here that once again, the bare room, just that palette there, this is direct, no influence. And all along, Lady Asagi has never ever moved. She's always remained seating. And Kurosawa himself said to her, and this was a real exercise for such a powerful and dramatic actress as she had been throughout her very lengthy career. In fact, from the mid-30s on to the time she retired, she was never played a supporting part. She was always the lead, the co-star, or the guest star, if they want. It was a smaller part, but she was prominent and dominating. Well, here, he directed her to act with her face immobile as though it were a mask. Once again, don't blink, but act with the body, be expressive with your body. And here, she's not sitting in the usual fashion. This is a very No thing, though, with one knee up. Now, here they are paralleling Macbeth, and this is where she first offers to do this. In a sense, could Toshiro Mifune, playing Washizu, but Toshiro Mifune, the most volcanic of performers on the screen, be portraying someone who's in fact a henpecked husband? Because she is the real operative here. And once again, the crow, the symbol of death, and his reaction. Yes, and she's pointing it out too. Of course, now she moves in the No fashion, feet sliding along the floor, the toes raised, and you will start to hear No music, flute, and drum. While Kurosawa, of course, loved the No, preferred it to the kabuki, and you will find the No flute, for instance, in just about every one of his pictures. This is the only one that is particularly No influenced. It doesn't fit very well with his normal convention of realistic style. And so it fits in an experiment, but it tends to be something that is all or nothing. She's using the typical arguments, do it because you love me, and aren't you a man? Now there's an even bigger picture. Take over the whole country. There is no shogun right now. Or if there is, he's just the figurehead. Other people have the power. And in fact, Mifune later starred in a picture called Furin Kazan, or Samurai Banners, for Hiroshi Nagaki, in which the whole point of the picture was a great general working for a great lord, subsuming his own individual in this man so that the country could be unified, sacrificing his own love to that idea. Well, that's, when she says unify the whole country, that's electrifying. Now we're also hearing an unusual sound effect, that sound of silk slithering. Of course, she has to walk that way, one, because it's No, but then also when you're dressed like that, it makes it difficult to walk any other way. Perhaps we might have heard it earlier, but then, of course, he also chooses which sound effects we're going to hear. And what can make things creepier than her walking off into the darkness and coming back and hearing the sound of the slithering silk? Well, here we have a different transition, rather unusual in this picture, a lap dissolve, but it's thematically linked because she's walking out with the drugged wine, and then we see the results immediately. Well, we can call this a parable about ambition, and of course, I was always a social critic in most of his pictures, but of course, it relates to things differently. This one is so detached and universalized that it's ambition in general, but of course, feudalism, once again, lives on in Japan, even now perhaps, but certainly in that period, and there's so many anti-feudal pictures. The whole business of loyalty. When do you stop being loyal to someone who betrays you, etc., etc.? It's in line with so many other pictures, aside from its general feelings about fate and ambition. That screen behind him, I don't know what it looks like to you, but that looks like a whole bunch of arrows to me. Elegantly displayed, perhaps. But, as we will see, arrows are real prominent in this picture and certainly provide the climax. Now, if the actress Izuchi Yamada looks like she's handling that spear pretty well, Well, yes, she has played many demure Japanese heroines as well as vicious ones like this. But in the mid-40s, during the war, she portrayed a young lady who, to get vengeance, becomes a master swordswoman. And in its big climax, she really wields that sword pretty well. That was a film for Keiji Mizoguchi. Now, here's another unusual thing, a close-up. This thing is mostly shot in a long shot, part of the distancing, part of the de-identification, almost the dehumanization of this picture. But in that close-up, when he got another mask to base his portrayal on, but obviously he had to be much more mobile because he's so frenzied throughout. After the first few scenes, he's got this burden of guilt and question. Anyway, right at that shot, Kurosawa, then that close-up, Kurosawa said, there, Mifune gave me that exact look, the look of the Haida mask, which is of a grand warrior. Now, just like in The Know, and in ancient Greek drama, both of them only would have, in the beginning, two people on stage and a chorus filling in the blanks and so forth. The earliest dramas of their own respective cultures, very similar. And in Greek and in No theater, the hairiest stuff generally takes place off screen. You might think, oh, well, we're going to open it up, we're going to see him murder the Lord. Guess what? We're not going to. But here the No music starts. And while Isuzu Yamada is not a No performer as such, while a distinguished stage performer in contemporary stuff, she is now going to do, while presumably the murder takes place, to the flute and drum of the No, a little No dance. And then she stops and looks at those blood stains that won't come out. Now we say that in the No, people wore masks, and there's only so many of them. Obviously, they're somewhat conventionalized. They're particular characters. But short of making it a marionette play, how do we get emotions, difficulties in there? It's done with the lighting and the how you move the mask around, how you place your head, and how you take the lights. For instance, if you lean forward, that's a convention, but also it changes the lighting and it will tend to show grief. But there are all kinds of other ways to add distinction, along with just plain body language and stances. Well, I mentioned some people say that Mifune overdoes it here. Of course, lots of times he's accused of that, but when you're so intense, someone once said of him that Kurosawa yelled, "Take it easy," but Toshiro Mifune couldn't take it easy when he was acting. You remember, we don't see him as himself except for part of one scene, and that is when he meets the witches. And we see him being genial and relaxed when they're joking around a little bit, waiting for the fog to lift with his dear friend Miki. But from then on, he has this prophecy hanging over him, and if Asaji is somewhat stylized in obvious fashion, well, so is he to a great extent. Now notice here, yes, she's washing off the blood, a concrete thing, but we're going to see that again. If you're up on your Macbeth, you know about the washing off the blood. I've always thought it was a little bit of a loose end that, of course, Mifune has, Washizu has blood on his hands. He doesn't waste any time washing the blood off that. Once again, as I say, he is somewhat stylized, not in the usual fashion, not in No fashion, not in kabuki fashion, but in a sense he's almost like a humor, that is, acting out anger, acting out this, acting out that, one particular thing, that guilt and anxiety that suffuses everything within him. And now it's time to give the alarm, and we're going to see what happens. Takeshi Kato, playing the major guard, talked about how he spent a week off and on sitting there on what was shot in the summertime, a hot, humid summertime, and waiting to be killed while the flies nestled over him. And of course, what does Washizu do right away? When the alarm is announced, he grabs his sword. He acts like it's a real alarm. Well, maybe he can relapse back into what his real life is. Takeshi Kato knew he was going to be killed by Mr. Mifune, so he put a block of wood up his sleeve to protect him. Well, Mifune was such a powerful man, powerful athlete, that sword thrust cracked right through the block and wounded him in reality, and he had the scar to this day. A wipe immediately the next day. Well, in Macbeth, Malcolm and Donalbain, the two sons, here there's only one son, of Duncan, just split. You say, well, things are fishy around here. Well, that's a little too easy, isn't it? So there's resistance to Macbeth taking over. Why does he just automatically take over? He doesn't. And here we have a flash of what Kurosawa normally looked like in those days. Those horses running out of focus in front of the camera, between the camera and the large spectacle. And here, this picture is a very interesting amalgam of the most intimate of two people sitting in a room talking and big spectacle. Well, now we have two horsemen arguing, and that is Takashi Shimura's Noriyasu, who is not quite Macduff, more like Ross. And here is the Malcolm figure, the son of the Lord. Obviously, Washiusa didn't fool anybody because he knows he's the killer. Now, he is using multi-cameras here, which allows for the element of chance. As we will see, as the Noriyasu figure rides off, he rides right into the pole. Well, obviously he didn't plan that, and that's the kind of thing when you have an extra camera or multi-cameras, you might well pick up. Boy, the traitors just proliferate here. Once again, Noriyasu is played by Takashi Shimura, and I said he's not exactly Macduff, he's more like Ross. That's because, of course, Macduff is completely cut out. As we'll see down the line, if you're familiar with Macbeth, Macduff's family doesn't get killed because there's nobody with a family, and he doesn't enact his revenge in single combat at the end because that's not that kind of combat, as you will see. Well, here, this one always looks a little cheesy to me because it looks like a B-Western where you're trucking back behind these people, chasing each other through similar areas. Well, not that Kurosawa isn't influenced by the Western, too. He loved John Ford. Some people have said, well, he's not Japanese enough. He's too Western. He's too... Well, as he said, I feel Japanese and I make movies just for Japanese. And, of course, modern Japanese would be affected by cross-cultural references. It's a lot clearer where it goes the other way because people have been ripping off, stealing, or being influenced by, if you want to be more diplomatic about it, Kurosawa for years upon years upon years. Kurosawa's children being an actual term that's used. That includes George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, maybe Scorsese, I don't know, less so. But certainly everybody imitates Kurosawa's treatment of violence. If we don't have a bunch of arrows sticking into somebody, well, we can think of certain analogies to other things. I don't know that Arthur Penn was thinking about Throne of Blood when he has Bonnie and Clyde being shot full of holes endlessly, but one can think of an analogy, and in fact, Arthur Penn is a gigantic admirer of Kurosawa. Now, as we go back up the slopes of Fuji, look at that dark soil. We're back on location here. Back on the one of the three locations. This is so impacted. There's so few characters and so few places, so stylized. You can see once again why Kurosawa demanded the wide, squat castle, because the horizontals here are much more oppressive. Of course, then there's a balance with the forest, which is vertical. And this whole sequence here, where they appealed to Miki, is not in Macbeth, but it is a very logical type of extension. In Macbeth, Shakespeare is often very tenuous about time frames. Here, since we are in Act 2, remember, it's all been the day in which the Lord announces he's coming, the night in which he's murdered, and today. Now here, the first arrows and the first contact is going to be made. Now, Noriyasu takes one in the thigh. Well, he's obviously padded there anyway. If you look carefully, he's extra padded. He probably got a block of wood in there, and the archer would be on a platform, say 5-10 feet high, 5 feet away from him. Still extremely dangerous because horses don't act. And then the Malcolm figure takes one in the arm where he's heavily armored, and there it's easier enough to put a little reinforcement in there. But that's how it's done. Those are real arrows. Kurosawa didn't like faking. It's very hard to do it when somebody's just sitting there and the horse is jumping around. Also, you notice when he has horses in all his pictures, there's not a Hollywood horse who just sits there and stays in close-up. They move, and it often seems that they move because they feel like moving. Now, relatively stable, but they are jumpy and nervous. They're not Hollywood-trained horses. And it helps that you have such a fabulous horseman as Toshiro Mifune riding that horse. Well, now this is a big decision he's making, a very strategic decision not to chase them, to wait and see what Miki's going to do with the castle. Well, arguably it's a big fat mistake because that castle isn't going to go away, and if Miki's going to hold on to it, he's never going to take it by himself, as we will see how impregnable it looks. And now a message from Lady Asagi. Yes, allowing for her amorality as a master of realpolitik, she's a worthy student of Metternich himself, who was, in fact, the foreign minister of the Austro-Hungarian Empire opposite Napoleon, and famed as a master wire puller behind the scenes, slippery operator, guy who snookered Napoleon in a few cases, and masterminded the concert of Europe that kept the peace, but it also kept the upper class in place for nearly a century, perhaps. And now as he rides away from the castle, there's nothing more ominous than a large, faceless building that's not replying to your cries. If that reminds me of a filmic situation, and perhaps also a novelistic one, if you go all the way back, well, I'm thinking of Beau Geste, filmed in talkies with Gary Cooper, directed by William Wellman, about 1939, and in the late 20s. And this is a French Foreign Legion picture where Robert Preston as the bugler, they're accosting this fort, and there's no reply from it. Of course, as we learn, all the Legionnaires are dead. It's one of the spookiest openings in films, and of course, Kurosawa was a big fan of Western movies from the 20s on. I don't know that he saw it. I don't know that he stole from it. I don't know that it meant anything to him. But makes me think about Beau Geste. Now we will see there's a master sergeant, a short man, leading out the coffin. And we will get a number of views of him. This is not the best, but as we get him into view, you will see he's the Kurosawa regular. Once again, it's a stock company, and these people keep coming back in various guises. Sometimes in bigger parts, sometimes in smaller parts, sometimes in what you expect them to be in, and sometimes completely cast against type. Well, that short man in front of the coffin is the actor Gen Shimizu, right? There's a good look at him. And he would play small, mid-range parts for Kurosawa, and veteran supporting actor in Toho films generally. Mifune starred for Kurosawa the moment he stepped on Kurosawa's set in 1948 in Drunken Angel, but then he was already up and coming, and then also he provided Kurosawa the perfect vehicle to bring across his messages. He could incarnate that character that Kurosawa was looking for, in my own view, in many of the films incarnating the character of Kurosawa's brother Heigo, that kind of pure, proud being that the world destroys, the nail that sticks up that gets hammered down. And Mifune himself, both with his enormous innate talent to that genius and that good sport, wanting to do the right thing, earnest man inside, could give him in a way that no one else could. The Promethean being that still was noble inside. I mentioned David Shipman's quote, "the greatest actor-director team in film history," and I certainly agree with it. But it is a synergistic thing. Both were great, but together they were both even greater. The sound effects of the large, creaky gate, amplified by Kurosawa, of course, because he picks the sound effects too. This is why Minoshaki was a great actor as well. Just the way he looks at him, you can tell that he knows. And it's emphasized by crossing the line. You will notice that his first look at him, when we look at them head on, Chiaki, the actor, was looking. This is the first shot. He's looking to his left. When we cut back to Mifuneo's Washizu, he was looking to his left. This is what's called crossing the line, and Hollywood eschews it at great length. Just to visualize it, you want the actors to be looking to opposite sides so it seems like the camera's between them and they're looking at each other. If they're both looking, say, to the left, it looks funny. It's called crossing the line because when you're shooting the scene, you draw imaginary line between the two people and the camera should not cross that line. Otherwise, you will get that mismatch. It's there intentionally so that even if you don't perceive it subconsciously, there will be that extra jar of the way they look at each other. In Macbeth, Banquo, in a little speech, talks about his suspicions, but that's all he does. And you may say, if Banquo's so noble, why the hell doesn't he try and stop Macbeth? Here we're going to give the motivation. And an extra thing, Duncan doesn't have a wife in Macbeth. Here the Lord does have a wife, and we see the extra consequences of Washizu's act. Obviously, he didn't fool anybody as to who really committed the murder because, according to Miki, she says, I'm going to kill myself because I don't want to see my enemy in the castle. Who is she referring to? While, of course, Washizu himself. Now, there's only one other wife in this whole story, and that is Washizu's wife, Asaji. What happens to her as the consequences of this act? The parallelisms, the recurrences, and so forth occur on any number of planes. I said there's going to be motivation. Well, here it comes as to why such a noble figure as Miki here is going to just let it ride when it's perfectly clear he knows who did the murder. Obviously, he operates from a view of realpolitik, that is, pure pragmatism regardless of good, bad, injudicious, illegal, or indifferent. What works best for the body politic as a whole? Well, they have spun this out at some length. Remember, we didn't know for sure that that gate is going to open, even if you had read Macbeth, of course, because there's no question of opening the gate in Macbeth. He just becomes king. It's mentioned off-screen that they have voted him in because it is, in fact, a elective monarchy. This is quite long drawn out, and some people complained about its longeurs. Well, of course, if you're talking about early Western critics, they complained about a whole lot of stuff. The ineffable Bosley Crowther of the New York Times found this whole picture kind of funny. And its thunderous climax he found laugh-inducing. Well, you can judge for yourself. And here we have a nice close-up of Gin Shimizu as we fade to black, and it's the end of Act 2. And you realize once again that was just a day, a night, and a day. Well, we're really obviously on the slopes of Mount Fuji. Boy, when he likes fogs, he likes them extreme. Once again, right after an act break, we have the chorus speaking. The second one from the right is Yoshio Tsuchiya, who I've mentioned before. The one in the middle is Yutaka Sada, who plays the chauffeur in High and Low, the greatest part of his bit part type guy career. And we'll see how the chorus commenting changes over time. And here we have the audience room of the Cobweb Castle. That clicking in the background is Mifune playing with his fan, a little sign of nervousness in anyone. Notice the background with those horizontal shapes. All along, although it's relatively consistent with the architecture, there are variations. These are very low-ceilinged rooms, and this is going to be reinforced by the horizontals here, already balanced in asymmetrically, you notice, by the vertical of the sword. And eventually this is going to be the most oppressive room, claustrophobic room of all, but that's in a later sequence. Well, now, in Macbeth already planned to kill Banquo from the beginning, and he didn't tell the lady. This is how Kurosawa makes Lady Asaji even nastier. He's giving a pretty good case for leaving Banquo alone, and obviously if they're not going to have a child, Well, it would be routine to adopt someone, even an adult, and make him their son, and that's a routine thing in Japanese society even to this day, and he would actually be their son. And that solves everything, keeps everybody happy. After all, Miki can't be king, but his children can be. Macbeth is just going to kill him because he ought to play it safe. There's a resolution, isn't there? Except we're going to get another motivation that Shakespeare doesn't have, and he has restructured this very tightly. There's no loose ends. There's no options because and is she really pregnant? Well, we're going to have to find out, but he's going to have to act on that. And with the shot cut to the Kurosawa motif of the horse, and we'll see whose horse it is in a second. But then as it gallops about, out emerges the owner. So where are we here? We're back at the North Castle, which he has now inherited and taken over from Washizu. And he's standing right where we first saw Washizu in that audience room where he had his first meeting with the lady Asagi. Well, now, these films are fully scripted. And Kurosawa himself eschews improvisation, although he rehearses quite a bit. Obviously, they work things out in the process. But that doesn't mean that the multi-camera technique doesn't allow for the happy accident, as we'll see in a second, as this horse keeps on running right over top of an extra. As in Seven Samurai, in the middle of a battle scene, a horse coming from an opposite direction ran right over an extra again. As we see, nobody's quite noble. Some are less calculating than others. But here, as we follow, why does Banquo, the Banquo figure of Miki, let it ride here? And as he explains that, let me talk briefly about the horse imagery. Kurosawa was a great lover of horses, and of course, samurai rode horses, and they make samurai pictures, etc. But they seem to know things. After all, the conclusion of Kagemusha comes when they find out their lord really is the double when he can't ride the horse. The horse throws him. He can get along with his grandson, but not otherwise. And the magical horses at the conclusion of Hidden Fortress who stop dead when it's time to do so, regardless of any motivation. I mentioned also the lack of improvisation, but the length of rehearsals. Here they rehearsed for a month beforehand. And yes, the Japanese cinema is like the Hollywood, as in you show up on the set and you start acting, except more so. They tend to not to have very many takes at all. I mean, aside from just one. Well, Kurosawa would rehearse endlessly, and then he might take one take, but with multiple cameras. Now it's the night of that same day. Here we see the chorus again, commenting, and once again, the horse motif. The horses seem to know things that we don't throughout Kurosawa. And here he does Macbeth one better, because Banquo is murdered on stage. But that's Miki's horse coming back riderless. A cut, which means simultaneous action in this context. And we'll have an extended take of this rather elderly performer doing a Kyogen dance, which is straight from the No. Although the words here are written for the picture, they're written in the No style. The actor doing it is Kuninori or Kokuten, you can pronounce his name either way, Kodo, who later played the patriarch of the village in Seven Samurai, but there he left his teeth out. Here he looks like a vigorous old man, presumably what he was. He was 70 years old at the time, but he'd been playing old coots since the 50s. Here he's allowed a much greater dignity and weight. You can see he's kind of like the senior conscience of the army in the final sequence. But of course, that big mustache and goatee certainly help out. Well, we have these very symmetrical head-on shots and the strong horizontals. And although we don't see the ceiling, we're very conscious that this is a very flat type of squat type of room, reinforcing the sense of oppression and claustrophobia. Also, here's another little reference after all. If you listen carefully to what that song was about, it's frightfully apropos, isn't it? Doesn't that make you think perhaps of Hamlet and the play that will catch the conscience of the king? Well, now, what would the Japanese audiences of the time make of Macbeth? Well, we can make one comparison, which is there are 4 screenwriters on this picture. 2 of them, Kurosawa and one of the others, had read Macbeth. The other 2 had not. That didn't mean they didn't know about it. After all, just about everybody who gets out of high school knows Macbeth. How many have read it cover to cover? Well, obviously a smaller percentage in Japan, but Shakespeare is a well-known author in Japanese and is performed on the Japanese stage in conventional fashion, if not as much as normal Japanese plays. Well, now, when Kurosawa uses the no properties throughout, what would contemporary Japanese audiences have made of this? Well, how many people have actually sat through Wagner's Die Nibelungen, and yet we kind of know what that is, and we kind of know what it's about. We might recognize a tune or two. Perhaps that's the comparison, because no, by then was a very rarefied art, and so the amount of people who would have seen a live performance would be minuscule, but they might have a general sense of what it was all about, subject to a level of certain education. You know, if you never got past the 5th grade, you don't know too much about Shakespeare. Same difference might well apply. Now we have a ghost, and in this case, it's another no element because he's made up to look like the masked Chujo, and he is spotlighted, and he looks like a ghost in general, even aside from that particular mask, a no ghost. Well, here's a particular advantage of the film in showing ghosts is, of course, in the theater they have to pop up and pop out and disappear, but obviously we're a third party here. We're not seeing it from his point of view. We see him looking, we see the ghost, we see other people looking, and then they don't see the ghost. Now, I've talked about the stylization in this picture at some length, but of course we have to distinguish between stylization conventions, cliches, the normal way of doing things, because like any genre, you expect certain things, and this is completely different because it's not like a previous samurai film, but it's not like a realistic picture, and it's not like you're filming a no performance. You're using elements of the no, and you're structuring the plot, the succession of the time frames, the blocks of time, so that it is a closed system, doesn't relate to real life, doesn't relate to anything else. It is in and of itself and closes in that circular construction. After all, it is an experiment. This film, very formal, stylized, is placed right in the middle of a whole bunch of very dynamic, very dramatic, very protagonist-oriented films. So those of us who started watching Kurosawa before his big change in style in 1970 regarded this as just a change of pace, an experiment, a jeu d'esprit, as it were. Critics have looked at the late period and said, oh my gosh, the despair, the gloom, the depression, the dark view of humanity. Well, it's all right here. Also, the detachment from humanity, it's all right here too. I've said this picture is kind of a look into the abyss, a nihilistic picture, a shutout in the way that Ron is a shutout. Well, that begs the question of what's it like elsewhere? That's not what he normally comes up with. Well, he's not Frank Capra, for crying out loud. And we have to be very careful of the intentionalist fallacy because, after all, the artist is different from the person. The worldview of the artist may be different from the worldview of the person as well. And for instance, if you make an exciting vampire movie, it doesn't mean you believe in vampires, to make an absurd example. Let's just say this, that in many of the films, up until the mid-50s, it looks like he believes that people can work together to better the world, and then he stops making those kind of pictures. What does he believe in? Well, that's a good question. Maybe he exhausted that vein. Maybe he didn't. As any great artist, he will have a certain tragic view of life in that, to quote Camus' Caligula, men die and they are not happy. But Does that mean there's not rewards elsewhere? Well, even in the dark period after Ran, which is a real shutout picture, a couple of years later he makes his last picture, Madadayo, which is no matter what goes on, no matter what happens, if World War II comes in and I have no place to live, I love my wife. My students love me. I love them back. They will remember me and revere me until I die. And I'm not going to die yet. That's what his last picture means. And that's a number of years after he says, there's nothing there. But then, of course, both could be true. Even a lesser artist can you plumb what he personally thinks from his works. Or maybe he believes all those things. If that's a conundrum, well, who can plumb the depths of the human heart, which is a line from Kurosawa's own biography. What is that little man carrying in his hands? Obviously, the head and the head of Miki. This would be routine because, in fact, head viewing ceremonies were a big deal after a major battle because it's not quite like scalps, but this is how you prove you've killed who you say you've killed. And after a big battle, there would be lots of important people dead, and that's when they would bring over the heads and they would view them. It was a very ceremonial type of thing. We're not going to see the head of Miki because he can't bear to watch it himself. Now, interesting juxtaposition here, as it were. If you look carefully, there he is. That's the actor Gen Shimizu, who, remember, was walking in front of the coffin of Lord Suzuki. But just like in Macbeth, he doesn't do such a swell job. And for once, she doesn't have anything to say. Although, once again, she doesn't have to say anything, does she? Just the way she turns and walks away. This is one of the closer and more dynamic and more typically Kurosawian shots. Just think about it in relation to, oh yes, the dynamism of that track in close-up. And now this. You notice that Gen Shimizu is a rather short, squat man, or was. Why is he cast? So he can do this death scene where his body anticipates it or builds upon this squirming, dying crab. And the symmetricality, of course, nothing's so constricting as symmetricality because you notice he throws his sword to one side and his scabbard to the other, retaining the symmetricality, and then those horizontal lines pressing down upon him. And that's the end of Act 3. And that was one day. We're symmetrical here even, as you will see, to one day, a day, a night, and a day, one day, and, well, we'll see how Act 4 goes. Notice here, as usual at the beginning of each act break, we have the chorus. But here, it's one heck of a wind. Well, as I said, Kurosawa likes extremes. And you better believe there's Jaigundo wind machines just off camera. Also, the commentators have changed. It was officers before. Now we have foot soldiers commenting. And they aren't exactly upbeat, are they? Talking about using nature and the elements. The great director Kinji Mizoguchi once said, well, I can work on the actors, but you can't direct a teapot. And then the great critic Tadao Sato said, no, but Kurosawa even makes the elements act. And wind is a great motif throughout, and in general doesn't mean something real good. Well, they're already prefiguring here in this very formal structure, act break, chorus, and so forth. And I suppose you could just take out the choruses to watch the, shall we say, the state of the state as it changes overall. And they're even doubting the impregnability of this castle. Well, we've seen what it looks like. And we now see an illustration of that adage, the rats leaving the sinking ship.
家が焼けるとき、まずネズミが逃げ出すというが。
Well, now here we get an actual straight cut, which means simultaneous in this context because it's all very formalized. And here he is elegantly attired and recovered from his doom-laden situation. Well, we can see that even if he is henpecked, in many ways, he is a very attentive husband. Now, the actress here, we'll see her face eventually, is playing the maid, and she is the actress Eiko Miyoshi. To be blunt, a rather plain-looking lady, and she's excessively gray-haired here. This is how he casts back and forth. 2 years earlier, she had played Toshiro Mifune's wife in I Live in Fear, although, of course, there he was playing a 70-year-old man with a certain amount of makeup. Well, this is another change from Macbeth. In fact, right about the same time as this picture, Laurence Olivier was going to make a film version, let me rephrase that, of his stage production of Macbeth. According to reports by people who were there, his greatest stage performance ever, or at least in the Shakespearean vein. But you notice there's no film of it, believe it or not. They wouldn't give him the money. He was putting together he was scouting locations in Scotland, and it just didn't come through, even with that track record he had already made Hamlet, Richard III, and then from the beginning, Henry V. They actually corresponded about this, Kurosawa and Olivier, and according to reports, Olivier loved his idea that the lady was pregnant. But then he said, oh, by the way, and then I love this idea, but I think that their child will be born misshapen and disabled or something. And Kurosawa was so shocked at what he viewed as a very inartistic comment that he then broke off the correspondence. When I talked about the changes for Macbeth and the condensations, well, he also throws out, obviously, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in the petty pace from day to day. And yet, of course, since it's acted this way in the bitter laughter and so forth, and he's speaking to the sword of the samurai and the helmet of the Lord, yes, I was a fool for wanting these things, even though I have lost what child I might have had. Here they are paralleling Macbeth, and it's not just Kurosawa writing. You'll notice there's 3 other credits. That doesn't mean that he is one of those kind of guys who gets the script done, writes a few words, and then takes the credit. No, he wrote scripts for a long time before he directed solo, and then he's written 1 or 2 solo since. The point that he makes is he doesn't trust himself to write alone because he might write it so that it'd be easy to direct, or he will only have one point of view. This helps enhance the richness, the three-dimensionality of the characters to have other people put in their points of view. Does this sequence look familiar with the wipes and all the messengers come hurtling in? We've been here before. Back then, a traitor in league with the Inuit were invading and taking the forts. Now, we have a rebel, this time against Washizu, joining up with the clan enemy, the Inuit, to start taking the forts and coming closer and closer to Forest Castle. Now I'll wipe a brief interval, and we have another circularity, the close-up of the feet. After all, remember that sequence between Washizu and Asaji, where you see nothing but his feet until then he turns and kneels down next to her. Now he's going to turn, and he's real unhappy. Well, we've seen this floor arrangement sometimes before. Here, what this is obviously his major officers, if not generals, but field officers, and this is the normal way to sit. He sits there, dominant, and there's parallel lines, and this is what, in every samurai picture, short of having a time machine and seeing that's what they did, but of course they would take that from old drawings. And they face in and turn to talk to him. You'll see that in lots of other Kurosawa pictures, but lots of others in general. But of course, once again, you're constrained. Nobody's just sitting around talking informally, and that head-on shot, well, we're off at a slight angle here. And there we are at the head-on with the horizontals and, even though you can't see it, that ceiling looming, and claustrophobia. Well, there's one way out. That lightning gives him the tip-off. The wipe too. Rain! When does it rain? Because he's going off to visit the spirit, which is once again a circle. But it always repeats somewhat differently. Noticing the massive redwood-like tree trunks in certain areas of this ancient forest, I am reminded of the even more massive tree trunks, admittedly artificial ones, of Fritz Lang's version of Die Nibelungen. Well, this is a 1920s German silent, but then Kurosawa was interested in the cinema and foreign cinema, particularly over Japanese cinema, from his earliest movie-going days, and allowing for the delay in getting it from Germany to Japan, I would expect that he almost certainly saw it. Interesting that this is one of the few times we see sun coming through, but that may be sometimes a technical requirement. Either that was the only time they could get the rain, but then, of course, Kurosawa uses artificial rain. In Seven Samurai, the final battle is done in the inundation, and that the script called for 3 rain trucks, and they used 6. Well, back on the set, the ground fog, but here the spirit arrives in a different fashion. It's reminiscent of the mountain witch who, in the end, flies from mountaintop to mountaintop with their hair all askew. Well, now, while Macbeth was Kurosawa's favorite Shakespeare play, he had only read it. I don't know if he'd seen a stage production. They do stage productions of Shakespeare in Japan. But he had seen no film version of it before making this. In fact, he had not seen the Wells version. He only saw that years later on TV. In fact, he wanted to make this picture right after Rashomon, but Wells had either announced or the picture was about to be released, so he held off on it. And so in that respect, it's a completely original conception, uninfluenced by any of the other versions, most of which have come after it. But Macbeth has been done all around the world. Of course, we think of the Orson Welles. Then there's numerous TV versions in several languages. There's the Roman Polanski version. There's 2 gangster versions, one Joe Macbeth starring Paul Douglas, and then Men of Respect starring John Turturro. And most recently, there's been a version made in Venezuela dealing with turn-of-the-century bandidos in the Andes. We also get here his version, this version of Can Birnam Wood Come to Dunsinane? Well, we're going to see how that's going to work. That's always done off-screen on stage, but cutting on the lightning. And we're going to, I'm not sure why they come in exactly, but these warriors who are going to upbraid him. That gentleman is played by a very recognizable actor, Nobuo Nakamura, who usually plays quizzical professors in the films of Yasujiro Ozu, who is certainly the complete opposite of Kurosawa. I don't know that he ever played in a martial arts picture as such. He is recognizable, even despite the makeup. Here, if you look carefully, you'll see that's Seiji Miyaguchi, who played the master swordsman in Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. He had never touched a sword before he played the master swordsman. He mastered that, but if he looks a little clumsy with the spear, you'll understand. Here, this gentleman, and even though I know who it is, I can't recognize him, is Isao or Ko Kimura, who is the youngest of the Seven Samurai. And this begins a whole tradition from here on out of Kurosawa having important people doing little bits in his films. When Takashi Shimura appears from here on out, it's almost like in a little guest star part, even with considering his eminence throughout all of other Kurosawa, with a wipe, which once again, at least in this film, always means a brief expanse of time. It's the same day. And here's the opposing army. I'm guessing it's less than 1,000 people. At first I thought maybe 500 to 600. Now looking again, I'm thinking, well, maybe a little more. It also reminds me of Spartacus, the moment when the Roman legion advances on the army of slaves. Well, had Kubrick seen this picture before he made Spartacus? It wasn't issued commercially in the United States until a year or two after Spartacus came out. He might have seen a special screening, but in any case, great directors often come up with similar solutions to similar problems. This seems kind of like an obvious one in a way. The high angle shot as opposed to head on. Now here, this is practically something out of Walter Scott, isn't it? Dramatic, sharply focused shots of these romantically behelmeted figures. Well, of course, that's Noriyasu. The guy with the triangle helmet is the son of Miki, and the guy with the horns is the son of the Lord. These dramatic figures against waving banners. It could be a Howard Pyle or N.C. Wyeth illustration to a Scribner's Illustrated classic of one of those swashbuckling adventure stories. This is the one time when that's not sentimental exactly, but it's always so astringent. It's kind of sunny, isn't it? Once again, that just underlines how misty, overcast, foggy, and miserable all the other weather is, which in many ways mirrors the plight of Washizu's soul and mind. Now they advance. Where's the discipline? Well, in fact, it wasn't until the late 18th, early 19th century that they observed marching in unison, marching in fours, etc. In battle, of course, they would have a tight formation. And the scene change, once again, is the wipe, meaning a brief period of time. Once again, the temporal blocks. And this is all going to be, in absolute symmetricality, a day, a night, and a day. Here the telephoto pushes them together. We lose a sense of the distance between him and his men, but look at this crowd of guys, all the different banners, because, of course, he's the centipede, but other lords are working with him. And as we come back, we're going to see the immense construction of this castle set on the Toho Studios lot at Tokyo, because he's going up a good 3.5 stories, and it's not like it goes in one direction, because you can see it looks back the other, but in the background you saw there the trees on the little knoll. Well, there are no trees on those upper slopes of Mount Fuji. Well, here we actually have a kind of point of view shot. Gee, are we identifying with Washizu after all? No, because we're looking at him looking. We're not looking on his eye line. If we looked through the window, through the bars at his face, and he's looking past the camera, you would get that identification, that subjective element. Now, by the way, here's one of his generals we see in profile to the left with the Abraham Lincoln beard. I'll mention who he is later. Now you see this wonderful shot of him against that mass of men, his men, and the look of indecisiveness because of those little bouts of decency and uncertainty still within him. Now, I don't know, there's several hundred there, but nothing makes it look more crowded than filling the frame. If you've got empty spots, everyone will speculate about how just beyond the edge of the frame, there's nobody there. The ideal, of course, is when they're falling off the edge of the frame. You say, oh, he's got so many people there, he can waste them. Now he's going to give the big pep talk to the crowd made up of spearmen. Notice the different levels of spears. Some are javelins, some are longer. But in any case, if you're going to form the porcupine, the phalanx, just like the Greek phalanx, the guys in the front ranks have to have a spear a certain length, but then the ones in the further back ranks have to be longer because they got to fit over past the other people to form the continuous line of spears. Here's the pep talk. It's well to remember that murderer that he is, he's still a magnificent warrior, a powerful and successful general, a leader of men. And here's how he does it. And this is the one time, in a sense, we're getting a point of view, because only the men down there could see him that way, but only collectively. There's no one guy there that we would identify with, and we don't cut back to see shots of them looking at him, except for those shots where you're looking over his shoulder at the crowd of men in the courtyard. Once again, the budget question, because what could be easier? Him acting to nobody, and then we get shots of the crowd the next day, and we shoot them and they're dismissed. Well, here we show them both in the same shot. That's what costs that extra little bit of money. And as they raise their spears, does that make you think perhaps of Close Encounters of the Third Kind when they go to India and they say, where'd that sound come from? And everybody, from the bottom of the frame come all those hands raised up. As has been noted elsewhere, Spielberg is one of Kurosawa's children, and he is on record as a great fan thereof. Kurosawa's children being an actual term that's used in Japanese and American film criticism wipe, and it's the night of that same day. And here we have this guy. I have to admit, I don't know the name of this actor, but he's practically omnipresent in tiny little roles in Kurosawa throughout, and with it hard to miss with those rounded kind of clownish features. And a different kind of view from a different angle of this immense construction. Well, who constructs it? I mentioned that they brought in the expert, and then Kurosawa disagreed with him, but co-featured as art director here with the expert is his regular art director, Yoshiro Muraki, who has built all kinds of things from this gigantic castle to the farm in Seven Samurai to constructing city streets on the back lot, contemporary city streets, because even now Kurosawa still made contemporary films. And perhaps one takes him for granted because they all look so real, but then Kurosawa, the perfectionist that he is, demands that everything be aged. For instance, the lacquerware here is made in the old style and is aged to a certain extent. In Redbeard, my God, the teaware, they poured 2 years of tea in it to get it stained just the right way. Now, they talk about this castle. Obviously, a genius planned it because even to the uninitiates, it looks pretty hard to attack. But we'll notice that in that previous chorus shot of the foot soldiers, the people at the bottom are starting to doubt that. Well, that does not bode well. I think Washizu could be accounted as having a little bit of a morale problem. Once again, Kurosawa takes what's in Macbeth and then goes a little step further. And once again, you'll notice that is a very intimate picture, and then the spectacle. Why are all these birds coming in here? Well, birds tend to nest in trees, don't they? And what could be happening to trees? Now, this actor, we've seen him before, I mentioned him. That's Yoshio Inaba, who is the genial Gorobe, the second in command, the guy who says, no jokes now when they're doing the samurai tryouts. This is the only other part he's had in the Kurosawa picture. Well, I might add on a technical plane, they had a mess of a time trying to get those darn birds in there because birds are not exactly that many. You don't train that many, and they just released them and shooed them in. It's obviously there's lots of cutting around to get all the bird shots that you got. He can laugh all he wants, but that bird sits, a wonderful, wonderful bit. The bird sits on him, obviously just a happenstance, and then as he pours out his saucepan of sake, that look of doubt. And the wipe to the very, very foggy morning. Once again, the unities of time, because this whole sequence, Act 4, has been a day, a night, and now the next day. And yes, the samurai would sleep in place, on guard, on that little camp chair. Voice is off. I noticed how his left eyebrow arched before he fully woke up. And he's making that walk he did before, but he didn't go quite far enough. And the dynamism, as he often uses, of people going against the flow. And we will recreate a very classic scene of English literature, but in a very different style. This is just only a mild reminiscence, but there's the elaborate kimono hung on the rack, which is mildly reminiscent of the witch's gown that gets whipped away to make the cut. Very unusual lighting here because you have a big hot spot against the back wall, which would not be realistic. but then it gives a complete whiteout to the sleepwalking and the hand washing. Of course, if you look carefully, there's no water in the pan. Now, when Kurosawa directed Isuzu Yamada to do this, well, of course, he had a great actress. To get the movements right, she practiced in her tap under real water at home because, of course, if you try to, that movement is so instinctual, to reproduce it without water, you might be faking. So she just did that, said, oh, now I know what I'm doing. And when they set up the shot, they yelled, no test. Well, and that would mean this is going to be the first take. We're not going to rehearse it. And she, with all her experience in film for even then 25 plus years, was very nervous. But that is the first take from the multiple camera of this whole sequence. Well, of course, it goes around because you remember how she washed the blood off her hands at the scene of the murder. And the makeup here is slightly different. She's got a rather clownish bow mouth, but then also you see her teeth in a way you haven't seen elsewhere. They look dark. Well, nobody knocked them out. That means she's married. In that period, married women would always blacken their teeth. You can see the way he says, Asaji. This man is deeply hurt. He's devoted to this wife, even if he is henpecked and she's evil. And madness, you notice he took the bowl away and she didn't even notice. This is another instance of the compression and intensification from Macbeth. Notice also he can still, when he does the spectacle, get the dynamism back in because the camera is slightly above the mass of men. We mostly see the tops of their heads and the spears and the banners going by. And then, of course, you see also all the different banners, all the people that are fighting with him. And he is, once again, running against the flow. Maybe it was a mistake to tip his hand about the prophecy. But of course, in his state of mind, even if no one knew that the prophecy is starting to turn against him, he might go to pieces anyway. The cries in the background start to fade away. We notice we're going to be coming to a conclusion. They stopped panicking and they want to find out what the heck is going on. Notice in the front is the very old guy, that one played by Kuninori Kodo, who's obviously kind of like the respected grand old man. Well, on stage, you can't show Birnam Wood come to Dunsinane, but on film you can, and never so effectively. It's spooky enough as it is, the whole idea of it, but you notice the trees encompassed in the massive ground fog. You might say, oh, it's miniature, so he can shoot around it. Well, in a later shot, you're going to see that's real trees, full-size trees. And it's shot with the telephoto to compress it all together. And then it's in slow motion to make it even creepier. Well, if you know your Macbeth, you know roughly why they're coming like that, but not all Japanese would. In many ways, it could be Kurosawa's one attempt at a creepy ghost story or horror film, and it certainly delivers the goods in that respect. Even here now, we're not seeing exactly a point of view shot. We're watching him look out, and then we see what he sees. Now, in just a moment, one of the greatest action scenes in films is going to start. If you've never seen this film for the first time, turn off the commentary right now and just watch it straight through. Since we have no Macduff, with his reason for revenge, who's going to finish off Macbeth, or Washizu? And remember what she said, it all comes around, the arrows from the rear. Since Toshiro Mifune went on to make a lot of other films, you know he's not going to be actually killed by arrows. But since he's Kurosawa, faking it is not going to work. The usual ways they would fake it would be the arrow is embedded in the wall and it pops out, and it happens so fast you think it came in instead of coming out, or it comes in on wires. That's not what's happening here. These arrows are shot by actual archers just outside of the frame. If you can imagine this, originally, Kurosawa wanted just a contest among the extras to see who are the best archers, and then those would be the ones. Well, Mifune said, it's me at stake. So you're going back to the Takeda School of Horse Archery, where you ride no hands and fire from a moving horse. You get those people, and they said, yes, Mr. Mifune. Now, we may think that all these things are happening in one because of the multi-camera technique, but actually he's probably cutting a whole lot. There may be continuity errors, and of course, the telephoto lens makes those arrows come a lot closer to him than you might suppose. And also, a lot of times he stops and then just moves one way, but still, that's extremely dangerous. The ones that hit him in the body, of course, he would probably have blocks of wood under the armor, and they would be impacting there. But even then, they're coming real close to naked parts of his body, like the face. So this is extremely dangerous. People complimented Mifune on his acting of extreme terror. His reply was, "Of course I was scared. Who wouldn't be?" In terms of reality, why are they missing him so much and forming these little barriers that stop him? Well, of course, while you're watching this incredible sequence, you're not sitting around worrying about why that happens. Partly it's claustrophobia. They're cutting him off. The most famous and final one. Well, obviously, that's a fake. How did they do that? If you look very carefully and replay it, you will see that as he moves up, an arrow flits between him and the camera. With the telephoto, it's out of focus. It goes in at a certain angle. They stop the camera, they bring in the makeup, and they put the arrow on his neck, but it's exactly parallel in the same line as at the arrow that flitted right across the camera. So we have the illusion that it whips right in. The ineffable Bosley Crowther of the New York Times found this very amusing. Well, you can judge for yourself. Bosley Crowther was famous for never getting the point of Japanese films. Actually, of course, it's perfectly feasible for someone to have all these injuries. Very few of those are mortal because when it's in the armor, it's not always penetrating very deep into the skin, or if at all. That one is a finisher, but he's more likely to asphyxiate than to bleed to death. So people have been known to do that kind of thing, come down the steps. You notice he doesn't draw his sword, the mark of the samurai, before he dies. But of course, Pike Bishop William Holden, his pistol remained in his holster at the end of the hecatomb, at the end of the Wild Bunch. So what are all those moving trees? And why did they cut them down? Kurosawa always answers these questions. And in terms of the size of those trees, if you look in the background, they actually have a gigantic one with a big trunk being rolled along on a cart for extra camouflage. And the wind comes in very strongly, that Kurosawa trademark. And we're back at the castle. The circle is about to close. As the fog comes in, here he's not waiting for fog. What he's probably doing is a lap dissolve over a whiteout. And we're back with the chorus from the No, announcing the moral. The moral of a world where there's no free will. It's fate. It's destiny. You can't escape. Here they're making it easy. Oh, it's ambition. Well, was it up to him? One might argue, is it up to anybody? But we can find of many Kurosawa films that say the opposite. Contradictions exist in all of us. And since Mr. Kurosawa, the great artist that he was, at least in that way, a much bigger person than the rest of us, much greater contradictions undoubtedly existed in him. which made him that much richer, deeper, a character and an artist, even in this very different film from what was the norm of that time of his work.